next time. My name is Megan Hayes. I'm the Director of Corporate Sponsorships here at HRCI. Today's topic is strategic HR for lean teams, aligning people and business objectives. A friendly reminder, today's slides will be available in the resources tab. So again, we're going to get that question hit right at the beginning of the webinar. But in the meantime, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Chloe McKenzie and Dr. Ken Matos, who will introduce themselves and take it over from here. Welcome to you both. We are so pleased to have joined us.
Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe. I'm the Vice President of People and Culture at one of the fastest growing companies in Canada. We're called SaltXC. We're an integrated advertising agency, second fastest growing large agency in the world. But fun fact is, I didn't grow my roots of career in HR. I'm a marketer by trade, used to creating large campaigns for clients like Google, Facebook, Shopify, and it's been really fun to be a marketer in a people role. Today, my scope reaches from core HR to talent, D&I, L&D, employee engagement, internal communications, and it's my pleasure to be talking to you today, as well as my new friend Ken, about all things strategic HR, leading with a really lean team.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Megan. I'm Dr. Ken Matos. I'm a Director of Market Intelligence at HiBob. HiBob is an HCM platform. We focus on helping our customers be able to understand what's going on in their business, how they are hiring, and supporting and understanding the experience of their employees in order to create better outcomes for all. My background is as an organizational psychologist, so I spent my time studying issues ranging from remote and flexible work to diversity and inclusion in the military to employee engagement across companies, nonprofit, for-profit, and governmental. And so today I spend my time at HiBob helping us understand what's going on in the HR community so that we can better design our products and our advice to the people who need it. To kick us off, I have a little bit of a presentation, just a couple of slides that'll help us sort of frame up what we're talking about today. So, as we said, this is strategic HR for lean teams, which always begs the question for me, what exactly is a lean team? So when I think about lean teams, I'm not focused on a particular number. It's not 2 people, it's not 10 people, it's not 1 person. I really think of a lean team as a team that has ambitions and responsibilities that exceed their resources. So you might have 100 people, but if you have work for 200, you're still a lean team. And so really what we're looking for is organizations where the HR team really needs to make thoughtful prioritization of the activities they engage in and ensure that they're delivering value to the organization in a clear and open way so that they can get a positive feedback loop of reinforcement and resources as they deliver on those goals so that they can expand which goals they can actually address.
And I love how you frame that up also as we start this conversation as, a lean team could very quickly be thought of as a negative, as like, I am time strapped, I am resource strapped, people strapped. But when you think of it as the gift of helping you focus and be more choiceful and intentional, there could be a lot of really cool things we discover about working across a lean HR team.
Absolutely. And arguably, most teams are lean because in many organizations, we think about setting the limit based on as much as you can possibly do. And so everybody's always pushing up against that edge where they're feeling like there's always so much more I can do. And we know that HR people care about their employees, they care about their organization. And so there's always a sense of, I could do more, there's more I could change. And so really understanding that the sense of being lean isn't a failure, but it is the reality of you have big ambitions. This is how you go about making sure that the ones you seek are the ones that you achieve. And so I like to think of a couple of steps and just trying to figure out where you focus and tying the initiatives you're doing to metrics that are in your organization so that you can have that really positive feedback loop. So the first big step is always understanding your bigger picture. Like what's going on at the organization? What are the metrics that they really care about? So not just HR is focused on turnover or hiring speeds, but what's the revenue achievement of the organization? How are we positioned as a brand in a market that we work in? These are all concepts that don't necessarily immediately hit an HR person's perspective, but they're the language you're going to want to speak when you're talking to an executive who controls the resources. And so being able to align what you do to those activities is really the first step. And so if you can't, at least in your head, say, I'm doing this HR activity to in some way influence this business outcome, it's a good sign that maybe it's not a high priority for you or for the organization. And that you want to be able to use these metrics to evaluate your priorities.
That's such a good reminder. I think as HR people, it is, of course, common sense that we are people leaders. But the most powerful way, if we can reframe ourselves as business leaders who are just as thoughtful as our finance people, our marketing folks, our folks who are influencing sales, we're just as thoughtful about the customer impact, how the company's doing, profitability. We get to marry the two of people passion plus really effective business progression. So really good reminder to start us off.
And really engage with the question of process. Like so much of what HR focuses on is how are they doing their work? Are they doing it to their best efficiency, given the people that they're using? And so there's always a way to sort of see your influence in all the other parts of the organization, as long as there's people in them.
Absolutely.
So sometimes these things can get a little fuzzy. One of the big things I see in survey after survey when I look at what are your data hardships is a question of like, how do I connect something like an employee recognition program to revenues? And so I like to talk about that as exploring the value chain and thinking about all the little steps that might go unspoken or assumed and put them on paper. So like for this example, we're thinking about an employee recognition program. The goal is to improve employee engagement. If employees are more engaged, they're going to take better care of customers so that they will be more satisfied, which will lead to more retention, which leads to revenue. And so when you play it out like this, you suddenly have a collection of specific things to look at and ways to fill in that gap between a recognition program and revenue that can be comprehended by somebody who isn't always thinking about employee experience and isn't really working in that sort of HR frame of mind. And then if you have various stories from colleagues, you can also get content from news and academia to really show that these relationships exist. They manifest at lots of different organizations and really walk through a overarching picture you can paint for your colleagues. And that allows you to say, like, if I invest here, I'm really investing in revenue. I'm not just doing employee recognition for employee engagement. I'm doing it for this concept of getting to revenue.
What I love about this also is it makes sure that we're not just doing initiatives for initiative's sake. And if you're on this call, maybe you too sometimes suffer from kind of HR project shiny object syndrome. There's always more to do. There's always, I'm a big fan of a white paper and a trends report, and it can be so tempting to feel like you've got to create something that's a best practice because you see other organizations and HR teams doing that. But if they aren't truly impactful for you based on where your business is at, the maturity, the scale, what you can handle, it's going to be an initiative for initiative's sake.
Yeah. Yeah. And that takes us to the next key point, which is how do I measure whether or not these initiatives are working? And so if you have that value chain, it becomes relatively straightforward to identify particular metrics that you can use to see if you're having the impact that you want. And so, for example, in this case, you would replace the recognition program with the participation rate. Are people actually using it? Because if they're not, then it's not having an effect. If they are, then you can move to that second question of are people who are using it actually showing higher engagement scores? Great. If they are having higher engagement scores, you can then do the third piece and say, do people who have higher engagement scores, or at least departments or stores or whatever a level of analysis you can get at while keeping an anonymization appropriate, you can then check and see like, oh, The ones who are engaged have customers who are happy. Customers who are happy stay and they produce more revenue. The end of this piece, you can just go to sales and say, hey, is this all still true? Great. Then the part that I proved on the front end shows HR's connection to it. And so being able to articulate your value chain makes it really clear, not just what metrics to have, but how you should be relating them to each other to show that your investments at the front end are having this knock-on effect throughout. A couple things that I think are also really useful when you're doing this is think about what your benchmarks should be for celebration and intervention. So when do you say this is working? And when do you say, I got to play with that recognition program? I'm getting a lot of participation, but the engagement scores aren't going up consistently. What are you looking for that? Sometimes that's a bit of experimentation. It's not always an obvious singular number. And you may want to play with it over time. What you're looking for is progress, not necessarily jumping to the perfect number from day one.
I feel this is important as well. In particular, if anybody's doing a learning and development based initiative, it's kind of like double this, like to the power of two, in that, oftentimes we are using employee engagement metrics as a way to understand whether something's impactful. And as you start to progress in your thinking on data, it's making sure, in the example of learning and development, are we measuring a benchmark of what did they know before this learning intervention and what has changed? Have they loved it? Their engagement was really high, but have they actually taken away the skills needed to be more effective in their business to, again, have that end outcome for customers and sales and revenue? So it's also how we evolve our metrics and thinking about what engagement looks like, whether we thought it was fun or not, but is the impact actually happening to get us to that end result?
100%. Being able to really know where you're starting really helps, because being able to show improvement over time is a really powerful argument, as well as improvement across groups. So we're always tempted to just roll something good out to everybody. That actually shoots us in the foot a little bit. We're often better off rolling it out slowly, having some control groups or a phased rollout where you can see differences between people who are getting your activity and people who are not. And that allows you to say, oh, look, there's a clear difference here. I once worked with an organization. They had a bunch of people who were engaging in a conversation with their leaders about their career progression. Some leaders did it and some leaders didn't. They threw a question onto a survey that said, have you had this conversation? And the stats were 10 to 30 points different across all these different engagement metrics based on whether or not they answered that one question yes. And so they were able to go back to their leaders and say, there's a really big difference between people who have this conversation and people who don't. Either it's a marker of leadership quality, or it's just a marker of the value of this program. But either way, we've learned something really useful just now.
Such a good example. Love that.
And, there can be a lot of metrics, and that's where things like an HCM can be really helpful to store various pieces of information, making sure that you can then report on them easily, connect the data. If you try to do all this in spreadsheets or by hand, it can become really overwhelming. And then you start looking for, like, what did we have last year? It's a file stuck somewhere in a drive. It can really make your life hectic. So being able to stop and be strategic about where you're storing information and what information you're storing can really help you move forward with this. Again, having a value chain can help you say, oh, I wouldn't have bothered to gather this data or keep it accessible, but it fits so neatly into the value chain, I really do need to record this.
And not to plug Hi Bob, I'm a very passionate, actually, Hi Bob advocate, but I love the dashboards and analytics we can see as we track somebody through an employee life cycle to see what was their engagement on a certain feedback survey that we ran, how are their performance reviews looking over time. You get to start to see how different interventions start to influence a person's employee life cycle. So my team loves Bob for that.
Thank you. I'm always glad to hear that. And then final step is, if you have all this information, you suddenly can prioritize really mercilessly and go in and say, all right, of all these value chains, which ones are actually delivering the most value, which ones are really effectively doing the thing I set out to do. You might have a great employee recognition program and everyone loves it. But if you're not seeing the relationship between engagement scores and customer satisfaction, maybe you have to look for another reason to do that program or consider whether or not you might want to drop it. There's also feasibility to start and maintain these programs. So do you need a lot of people to keep it going? Does it require constant updates or intervention or tweaking? Are you willing to commit to that? Because I think one of the other things that's really important with a lot of HR activities is you start them and they have to continue, because if they stop, the employee feels a loss, and then you have to coach them through letting go of whatever you invested in. And so really thinking about that before you jump in is going to be important as you accumulate value chains and activities, so that you can say, we do this, we have to give up something else, or we have bandwidth, or we're going to have to get bandwidth in order to support these things. And then finally, all that rolls up into costs and resources. At the end of the day, it takes money to pay people to spend the time doing really great things. And so how are you going to make sure that they have what they need to be able to dedicate their time and attention to these activities?
I have to say, HR people, compared to many others, they're some of the hardest people on themselves in the business. And it can be really hard to let go when you've invested time to stand up this beautiful little project and you're seeing it launch and it doesn't quite have the effectiveness that you thought that it would. It's a really hard thing to feel like you've got to let go, start from scratch, or to, admit that this is not where I needed it to go. In my own experience as well, I think we're going to have some fun in our discussion on this topic, but it's as, we're quick to launch. I'm sure many of the folks on this call are really great at launching. And sometimes we underestimate the change management that needs to happen along the way, the communication chains and protocols, and adding good feedback loops, being able to, check in with the people who you're going to consider your champions and those who are coming up as detractors, and really trying to hone in on what they're sharing. Sometimes it's not necessarily the elements of your program, but it's how you've socialized it and marketed it and packaged it and prepared your leaders to be able to get behind it. So it's a bit of a dance here. So sometimes it can be discouraging, but it might actually be a couple percent pivot to make your initiative look that much more successful on paper.
And every time you let something go, you recoup resources that you spend somewhere else. And so I think it's so important to always be looking at it from the perspective of, how is my overarching HR program manifesting and helping people, rather than any one particular initiative. Otherwise, you suddenly end up with too many things in your arms for you to carry. Whereas if you can be really thoughtful about which ones are delivering the most value, everybody still ends up happy, but you also end up with a workflow that you can actually sustain.
Absolutely.
So we're about to jump into just a more back and forth discussion, which I'm so looking forward to. I just want to let everyone know that we have our HR strategy and business alignment workbook. So there's a lot more we're going to talk about with each other. There's also some further steps and details of that process that I described, as well as some practical insights on how you carry those messages to the rest of your organization. And those are available in the workbook link that's on the screen. It's included in the resources tab, so you don't need to copy it down. And now let's just have a discussion.
Well, I'd love to pick it up actually, we're talking about this idea of keep or cut, right? And trying to make the tough decision about what needs to stay and what needs to go. I think it's worth mentioning there's for sure this competition, or tension, I should say, between what your lean HR team can manage in terms of capacity and priority. But it's also interesting to know that may be different than what the business can sustain. So you may have lots of energy and heart and bandwidth to roll out 6 initiatives for the year, but wow, are there a lot of other competing priorities that include growth or M&A, or some big products that your company is trying to launch into market that makes participation and success of those things inevitably not good. I'm curious, how can we, advise some of our HR leaders in looking at that tension and deciding keep or cut against what I can do versus what the business can actually sustain?
So I always like to take a step back and be like, where am I getting my reinforcement from? Like, am I doing this because I just really like doing this thing? Or am I doing it because it's actually helping all the other people out in the world? And I have a lot of conversations where I have to remind myself, like, I want to go down this road and talk about this cool stuff. It's not what my audience really needs to hear right now. So I guess I'm not going to do that. Breaks my heart a little bit. But like, I think always liken that to an HR person saying, all right, I'm trying to help the business accomplish these goals. Sales needs to double in size in order to make some financial goal. There's a lot of people who are going to be frustrated and overwhelmed if they don't have the right numbers. And so doubling down on helping that initiative succeed as opposed to starting something new can actually be really rewarding, both for the business and for me, if I can like really lock down that that's why I'm doing this. And I think really thinking about that connection to who are the people that you're actually helping makes it a lot easier to let go of a program, because if it's not actually helping people, like really having the conversation from people first rather than from program first can really flip your whole way of thinking about it.
And change takes time. I think we always underestimate how long change takes. I'm curious if you've come across any research that actually helps this group to quantify that. Like what's a level of touch point, or how many times does somebody need to hear a message, or what is it really like to move somebody's mind or behavior or habits and change onto the path that we need them to go?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a sort of rule of thumb out there, like people need to hear it like 7 times in order to have it stick. I think I think the real piece is you need to hear it when you're going to use it. So one of the problems with any sort of change process or learning process is integrating the new information into your behavior. And so that if you don't hear that information at the time you're going to act on it, it sort of gets stored in like a passive memory part of your brain rather than integrating with the behavior. And so, in many ways, doing less and talking more about it gets more done than doing a lot and allowing everybody to sort of fragment across, like, wow, you did 15 things. I barely remember the first thing you mentioned. And so, I think, again, the prioritization allows you to not just prioritize what you do, but what you're talking about. And so another like tip you can use is think about the meetings that you're in, the times you get to talk to people to motivate change, and let that be like your budget for activities. If you find that you can't talk about everything that you need to talk about within those meetings and conversations, you're probably doing too many things that need to be discussed. And so that's a good sign that you need to take a step back and either focus on something or get deputies to keep those conversations going when you're not.
Such a good point at the end there when we talk about deputies, right? It's one thing for you and your team to stand these things up and they have good success, but at some point, in your words, they have to continue. And feeling like we have a good plan to enroll other ambassadors to be the loudest voice on these topics and carry the, evolution through their teams is it also a very underrated step in the long-term success of these projects. But it's so important to focus on the ones, again, that are active champions, even without being asked or being voluntold to do so.
Yeah. And sometimes you actually want to talk to the most negative people or the hardest people. One of the tricks that I learned from my career was going to people who were like, I don't like what you're doing. I think it's dumb. It's a waste of resources. And just saying, like, what would need to be true for you to get behind this? Because one of the things that happens is if you ask somebody, why don't you like this? Their brain locks onto all the ways in which it sucks. And then when you ask them to change their mind, like, but I just walk through everything that's bad about it. Why would I change my mind? Whereas if you ask them to consider it from what would need to be true for you to get behind this, A, they tell you so you can make changes, but B, they actually start exploring what is good about what they're talking about. And so they're suddenly like, oh, I actually like 70% of this. It's just this 30 that's stuck in my brain. And if we work through that, I'll become an advocate. And having the most negative person flip into a supporter is actually one of the most powerful ways to move a group, because people perceive them as the most honest and credible because they had previously said, you know what, I have problems with this, but those got resolved.
100%. It's better questions get you better answers, right? You're forcing people to reframe their perspective and to show you, okay, give me the 2% of what's positive. I heard you hate it, but give me what's working so I could latch onto that and evolve the thing.
Yep.
Now, Ken, I wanted to ask you, we spent some good time at the start of this, sort of adding some definition around lean teams. And I thought it was worthwhile us talking about what does it actually mean to be strategic? Because, I can hear the real talk skepticism in the minds of some folks on this call, because I get it. We're all overwhelmed. We are the coaches, the cheerleaders, we are a counselor, we are a therapist, we are solving people problems all day. And at the end of the day, you need time in your calendar to be able to be strategic and to be thoughtful and to lift up from the work. What in your minds, when we think about being strategic and being strategic HR leaders, how can we help the group define what does strategic look like?
So for me, strategic fundamentally is knowing why you're doing something. If you can go in and say, like, I am doing this for these reasons, it gives you a lot of power to say, those reasons are no longer true, so I can stop doing it. Those reasons have become even more powerful. I need to sink more resources into it. I can compare the different outcomes and say, am I doing this for employee engagement to drive revenue, or am I doing it to advance the mission? It might end up, it's not a connection between engagement and revenue. But we do see a really big connection between engagement and actual achievement of our organization's mission. Like, that's still a value proposition. And so you would still be doing that program because it is accomplishing something important, as opposed to cutting it because it's just not doing the obvious thing. And so for me, I know I'm being strategic when I'm able to say, this is why I'm doing everything I'm doing. And that allows me to make choices about it in order to keep that going. A lot of people will be like, strategy is this big, complicated thing. It really is actually a very simple concept.
Yeah, there's this dance between sort of the business acumen related areas of strategy. So big picture thinking, being able to connect the dots of what you're doing, aligning to business objectives. We talked about data-driven decision making, but there's actually a lot of things just on a behavioral day-to-day level that can make us more strategic, moving from a mindset of proactive versus reactive, being as HR leaders in our own sort of growth mindset and thinking about continuous improvement and learning. And one that I think is really underrated and something I continue to work on is how we influence other stakeholders and partner with them and build those relationships across our organization to really be dialed into what is meaningful for this group. What might be the thing that this group is going to hate because I truly understand the dynamics of their business. What can we give in terms of tools and day-to-day habits? What does it look like to be strategic on a Monday, on a Friday, on my day-to-day work?
So I would say before you do anything, ask what you have to accomplish today. And you'll find that a lot of the things that are going to ping you are actually not on the list of things you need to accomplish. I really enjoy a triage approach. So triage is a way that doctors decide in emergency situations who gets care, and it's a life or death scenario. And it really helps me recognize nothing that I'm doing is truly a life and death scenario. So I can make decisions using this and nothing horrible is going to happen. And so what it basically says is, how much value is this activity going to do for the business, and what's the deadline? And so when you start comparing things across those two lines, you start seeing a pattern of things either falling into important and immediate, which you should just do, important but not immediate, so you can put it on a roadmap, you can wait till later that day. There's immediate but not important, which is like the person who just keeps poking you and being like, where's this thing, where's this thing, where's this thing? Like, I just want you to stop. I want to feel good about giving you what you want, but actually it's not important. So you're just gonna have to wait, person. Um, and then there's finally not urgent, not important, which really raises the question of like, why am I spending brain space on this in the first place? Very
Mhm.
often things that are urgent and not important migrate over into that last category because really the urgency is not coming from you or from anything that you truly value, but from somebody else's needs that hopefully in conversation you're able to establish isn't really that important for the collective group.
I love that. And you use the term triage. We were talking a little bit backstage about Stephen Covey's quadrants and time management principles, kind of same. And, on that note, I'm curious, and maybe drop this in the chat. How many of you actually look backward at the things that you've done for the week, the things that drained your energy, the conversations that took way too long, and done an audit of in the moment, I thought this was so important, and it ended up not being that. It ended up being something that sucked my energy and drained our time. I think we could all be a little bit better at auditing in the moment and looking back the things that we've done and trying to actually define how did this task ladder up to a greater objective? How is it important to the goals of the company, the priorities? Where do I need to make different decisions? But if we're never actually taking the time to make space to reflect on those things, we tend to run into a pattern of this same cycle week to week of being lost in things that are not strategic and are very tactical and not very effective for us as strategic HR leaders.
I have a question for you, Chloe. You are in the trenches doing the work on a day-to-day basis. My role is often like, hey, Ken, go off and be strategic. Like, that's literally something that carve out time for me to do. How do you go about doing that when you're looking at your calendar and protecting your time and making sense of all the work that you do?
It's a great question. And I, in full transparency, still continuing to hone that skill, but here are some things that I'll share that have really helped me. I'm a little bit ruthless about my calendar in terms of blocking time just to be strategic or focused time to think about, not even to work through planning big initiatives, but to think through all of my rolling thoughts about whether this is going to be important or not. So intentionality around my calendar is really important. We spent a lot of time in the last year and a half intentionally mapping every initiative, not only to a broader company goal, we use an OGSM framework for our corporate goal setting, but to a value as well. So sometimes, to your point, it can feel like we don't have the right thing to affect that end number, like that revenue goal or like that acquisition. And we've got to come a little bit along the value chain flow. And for us, that looks like our values. So if we can at least be more closely tied in an initiative to a value, we can feel really good about, okay, if nothing else, they've adopted the ways of working that we deem will make somebody else successful. Something else that, I coach my team to do a lot more now is to just ask way more questions. Ask why before saying yes. When somebody is trying to get you to do something, can we take a pause? Can we get to the root of helping them understand, is this thing, where's this on your priorities? I heard accounts is supposed to be focusing on this thing. You're asking me for this. Where does this sit in your world of prioritization? So being a little bit better at just asking layers of questions, that is especially true for your most senior stakeholders before committing to just saying yes when we're asked to do something.
That is so important. That just like, why are we doing this collectively rather than just being like, someone asked me for something, so I'm just going to drop everything and go do it. Interruption is such a killer to productivity that like that rigor and making it a value so that if somebody does it, they're not challenging authority, they're actually trying to participate in good management is a really key point to all of this. If you don't have that as a value, you're going to find it hard for people, especially as you go down the ladder, to be able to participate in that thoughtfulness.
What advice, and I'm curious for anyone on the call who this might, resonate with. We're making an assumption in this conversation. We are talking about a business's strategic priorities under the assumption that the business is very clear on what that looks like. And right now, we're in a time and a climate where things are changing very rapidly. We've got, 2 years ago, we were working through a pandemic. We're working through, the world's awakening to anti-Black racism. We're working through hybrid work, Gen Z. Now it's AI, and everything is changing so quickly that even your leaders of your organization are probably trying to figure out how to adapt their business strategy, which means, it impacts what we do. How can we, support them in those activities and create some checks and balances to say, is this strategic priority still true for us? Does this still make sense for us, not only in the people stream, but as a business?
There are some universals that are never going to move. If you're a for-profit business, revenue is always going to matter. There's always going to be a conversation about costs. So those are like good starting places to just say, like, how does whatever it is we're doing affect these kind of universal survival aspects? Then you can move a step up and say, how does it affect more broadly how we exist in the organization? So the culture, the values, like, we know we have to have revenues, but there are many paths to revenues. So some of them are closed because the market doesn't allow them. Great, let's stop talking about those. I think letting some conversations go is one really powerful way, and just like reminding people, like, we've already determined that that path is closed. Let's not revisit it. Then there's the paths you choose not to take because they violate some other goal, and really helping maintain that connect the dots between, okay, yeah, we could do layoffs without severance. That would save us a whole bunch of money. That will probably spike our turnover. It'll ruin our employer brand. We'll suddenly find ourselves unable to grow back if you succeed in reversing this. Ultimately, leader, it is your choice, but you've got to balance not just today, but tomorrow. And that I find is so much more helpful than telling them no. Because so many leaders, by their nature, want to control. It's part of it's the fun of the job for them. So really being able to take a consultative place of, if you do this, these things are likely to happen. Have you planned for what you're going to do around that to turn that potential bug into a feature? And when you're just asking them these questions and helping them think through it, they're much more open to the back and forth than if you just come in and be like, no, we're not doing this. This is bad for this reason. And then they just resist you.
So true. I'm seeing lots of really fun questions in our chat. I know there's some curiosity just around the reality of, I love this point, Catherine, the reality of HR folks, shared service folks, generally being looked at as being of service to an organization. In this conversation, we're talking about a lot of things that will require you to say no to some extent, right? We've got to be choiceful. We're setting boundaries. We're asking why instead of saying yes. And, it's how do we push back with that grace? And, I'll give you my thoughts, Ken, and I'd love to understand yours. I think when we think about capacity, if we can start thinking about time as money and budgeting our time in the same way, your sales force is budgeting their money, you start to see, some really interesting things in terms of what you can start to say yes and no to, and also where you need more budget, right? So there's going to be a long list of tactical things that need to be completed. I'd be curious to audit those. How much time are you actually spending on things that are repetitive or that are, coming up week after week? It probably is identifying a different system or workflow. It's probably addressing an issue that you're right now fixing the symptoms, but not addressing the root cause. But you need to do those activities to make space, make budget to be able to work through strategic thinking. But that can feel hard in the moment to articulate that to a leader. I get that. How do we think we can address that tension of being of service, setting boundaries, and making room for and time for more strategic activities?
So I think at the end of the day, the strategic activities are in service to those people. So really drawing their attention to that is going to be important. One of the ways that I've done it in the past is more of a yes and combined with, why are you doing this? So the straight up asking, why are you doing this, can feel aggressive. And instead saying something more along the lines of, no, that's an interesting idea. Help me understand what we're trying to accomplish so I can maximize our resources and efforts and really get us where we want to go. And so you're showing I'm willing, I'm engaged, I care about what you want. And through understanding it, you can then say, yeah, we really do want to achieve that goal. I agree with the goal. Let me tweak the method a bit. So, for example, I had a customer who was dead set on doing reading through all the comments of a survey that had 10,000 people in it and giving them a thematic analysis, which is like a couple pages summary of 10,000 comments. This was before AI. And I was like, I can physically do this. That's 3 weeks of work. And you're going to get like 5 points out of this. Like it's really low value, lots of work. And so I was like, talk to me about what you're actually trying to accomplish. Like, what is it you're hoping this will get you? And they articulated an answer to a business question that they had. And I was like, actually, there's a much more efficient route to get you that in a fraction of the time. Here's how we do that. And so I never said no. I never said that was a bad idea. I never implied that I was refusing to engage in the process. I really just said, like, I can get you what you want so much better through this other mechanism. And they were like, well, then duh, go do that. And so I think that's really what you're trying to do is be a partner towards the end goal. And that requires some self-control in that moment of panic. We're like, oh my God, that's 3 weeks of work. And I have 15 other things that all require me to work in on those 3 weeks. But if you can sort of like calm that moment, find your inner peace for a second, and then go back and do that exploration and discovery, you can often offer them suggestions in the frame of, this is just the most efficient way to get you what you want. Why wouldn't you choose that?
And especially when you're one of one, this is where your network of HR folks becomes important. I can't, tell you or understate how effective it is to have people to bounce ideas off of. Tell me how you're working through that problem. You're also working to do more with less. What are some of the tools that you're using? This is certainly not a webinar focused on AI, but if you're on this call and you're not yet looking at AI tools proactively that are going to shortcut your work, you're missing out. And hopefully, your organization is one that both is compliant and allows you to use a service like ChatGPT or otherwise, things that should have taken you a lot more time, creating those large decks and reports of that last engagement survey. Those are things that should take you, a couple of minutes to do on ChatGPT, and understanding the prompts that help you, again, consolidate work, look more strategic in your output. But we have to be proactive at looking at those tools because of the nature of the structure of our teams.
Also, use your vendors mercilessly. So I was talking to some colleagues before coming on this, and one of the most interesting things one of them was saying to me was, every time she starts at a new company and she does startup kickoffs, so she's usually their first HR person, she's like, I go to the EAP and I hammer them for every single perk and support that they have, because there's almost always a bunch of things they threw in for free that no one uses, that if I spend my time at the start really making a strong connection between all the managers and the EAP, many of the things that would normally come to me and suck up all my time got resolved between the manager and the EAP. And that got her huge freedom, especially when she was like, you come in, resell me, but do it in front of all these other people so that they understand why we have you. And that was like one of her key methods to getting back time.
I love that. I'm also loving Bob's AI now text summaries within our engagement surveys. That's saving us a lot of time as well. But you don't, use your tools, use your vendors. I 100% agree with that. I think we're approaching probably time where we want to do a little bit more Q&A. And Megan, I don't know if there's one you want to queue up for us.
Yes, thank you. Before I get to the Q&A though, I just want to say thank you to our speakers for this amazing webinar today. The feedback from the audience was excellent and hope that you all join us again for another webinar coming up soon. And thanks to our attendees also who joined us and also participated in a very engaging chat. We love hearing from you and hearing your great insight to what our speakers had to say today. Again, please feel free to bring a friend next time, whether they are certified or not. So I'm going to go a little out of order of the Q&A because I saw a question that I just absolutely loved because it also spoke to what you had mentioned, Chloe. So asking before saying yes, love this in principle, but in our HR leaders view us as a service organization to our staff. We are there to enable and serve, which means we should always say yes. But how do we push back with grace? Would love to hear both of you and your insights on that question.
Yeah, Ken did a great job touching on this as well to say, it's yes ands, and it's making sure that your questions give them space to reflect and look inward about what you're asking them to do, not as a place of defense, but in a spirit of partnership, being able to both come to a solution together that makes sense versus a wasted time on a bad approach or wasting effort on an initiative that's not really aligned to what the business needs to be focused on. So it really does come down to great open questions that don't lead to defensiveness, but lead to openness, partnership, and collaboration with your stakeholders.
I would also add identifying those stakeholders you have the strongest resistance to saying no to, and talk to them a little bit more when you're not under pressure so that they really have a sense for your commitment to the larger goal. It'll just make it so much easier when you do need to say, like, can we talk about that? Because you're already in conversation with them.
Yes, excellent suggestion. One thing I forgot to mention to our attendees, these slides are located in the resource tab at the bottom of your screen, as well as the alignment workbook that was mentioned. So please refer to that. And then if you're looking for that recertification code, I promise you we will get to it after our Q&A. We've had a lot of great questions submitted. We want to make sure we take advantage of our expertise of our speakers. So this comes up a lot too, this next question. So a lot of ideas shared already connecting to this question. Any thoughts on staying strategic on a lean HR team while undergoing direct team changes? For example, team layoffs. I'll start with that question first.
Yeah, I'm just reading the little bits of bobs at the end of this. The combination of change management, remaining strategic without hitting burnout seems to be a unique challenge for many HR teams given the current environment. Oh, this is a really juicy question. Okay, so how can we stay strategic with lean HR team? I would say honestly, step one, and we're guilty of this as people with high expectations, toughest on ourselves. We have to still manage our own expectations. I would really say that as a step one. So I know a lot of you high achievers on the call. There's a lot we want to accomplish. If you are short resources, you're short bandwidth, you literally will not be able to accomplish the same amount of things. So managing our own expectations, resetting those expectations as the structure of your team changes. You have to, put your, what do they say on the airplane? Put your life vest on first before you help others. Set yourself in a way that you can prevent burnout and be of service to others. I'd say like that's a very first step, adjusting your expectations as the needs of the business changes. And then, starting to prioritize, again, always looking as the data changes, how has this recent change, a layoff, something happening in the business, how has this reshuffled the order of things that are most important for me to accomplish? Where does my 3-month timeline need to look like 6 or 9 months? What actually now is irrelevant based on the fact that there are no people working in this department? Like, I think it's very fluid, the nature of what we do. So you kind of have to always be auditing, but also setting first your own expectations in order to mentally be able to get through all the things we got to get through. What do you think, Ken?
So I think there's a couple of things there. Like if you're using the triage framework I described, really honing in on urgency of like will allow you to create a roadmap and say like, yeah, we'll do all the things. It's just going to take an extra 6 months, but like they'll get done. And we put them in order of like what could actually be done last and not create a big problem. if there's nothing that actually fits in a reasonable framework, at least you're articulating the challenge in a way that somebody else can understand. And it's not just like, oh my God, that feels like so much work. Because the emotion often doesn't resonate with many leaders, but like being able to show them a timeline does. Similarly, if you have all those value chains, you're able to say like, okay, this thing was related to revenue. This thing kind of stops at just employees being a little bit better at customer satisfaction, but like renewals aren't for another 3 years. So we have time. That can really help you do that strategic prioritization. But at the end, it really is what you said, Chloe, of like being sensible with yourself, but also being able to have that graceful conversation of like, you can't have as much as you used to have if you're not paying for it.
Very good. Thank you both for your suggestions and your answers to that question. Next question is, what tools would you recommend for HR to increase their business acumen to help support their stakeholders and provide recommendations?
Wow, which tools? I'd say your biggest tool to understand the business is the people already working in the business. So if you're not already spending a lot of time meeting with people in other departments, learning about what they do, what are the challenges that they face, where are the tools that they feel like they don't have in order to be successful, like interviewing other folks across the business is probably your number one place to start. Hopefully at some level, maybe you might be lucky to be a customer of the business. Like I think learning about your business from that end can also be really interesting. Just to see on the other side, what does this bad customer experience I just had mean about what I need to do differently to prepare our teams to deliver on that. That could be a really great strategy. And also, ChatGPT, my friends, get creative with your prompts. An example prompt I might use. So I work in advertising. My prompt might look like this. I'm an HR leader that works in advertising. I understand my business, offers these type of services to clients. What do we think are the most important skills, somebody in the business might need to learn? What do we think our clients are going to press us about most in today's climate? Like you go down the rabbit hole, treat that tool like your thought partner, your brainstorming buddy, like an expert on your business, and prompt accordingly. You'd be really enlightened and surprised, I think, about the things that you can uncover when you're thinking about prompting, like having a conversation with an expert.
I would emphasize you are an expert in your organization in what you do, and you bring that expertise to your colleagues. In exchange, it is only reasonable that they share their expertise back with you. And so take them out to lunch and just be like, hey, I'd love to talk about what you do, how you do it, what's important, what do you find most interesting about your job? And they'll start talking about their things. And if you just listen, you'll start to piece the stuff together. What are the acronyms they use? What are the metrics they talk about? What do they say their boss cares about? It starts assembling itself pretty quickly. If you just can get over the sense of, oh, I'm supposed to know this. You're not. You're an HR expert. You're not a marketing expert. I, for example, am an organizational psychologist. My specialty is in HR and analytics. I now work in a marketing department. There's so many colleagues I have to go to and be like, what is that? Why do we do it this way? Why are there so many different fragments of marketing? Like, what's content marketing versus performance marketing? And I just have to own the fact that I don't know those things. And it builds actually a better relationship because then they feel safe coming to me for questions just like I do with them. And you can just turn all those people you work with into your tutors.
I love that. That's great. Um, Especially just in general, we never know what other people are dealing with unless we ask or, offer an opening for that discussion. So I think that's great. Okay, one last question before we have to wrap up. How do you build a partnership that is able to influence implementing solutions? Would you suggest presenting a data story?
I think you need to know your audience. So I've literally told someone your data story is useless because this person doesn't care about data. They It was all about remote work. They presented dozens of data stories, all these ways it would have supported the business. And they were just like, no, no, no. Like, it's not a data story that they need. This is probably tied to some sense of what is proper work, and you need to engage with that. What's their narrative about what's happening with their employees and the kinds of people who would do this? Because if you can't change that, you don't care because they just don't like it. Whereas I've had other people where it literally is like, oh, I just show you some numbers, and they're like, great, that makes sense. I'm gonna go do that thing. So I think this is a place where we should own being people, and for each audience go like, what persuades them, and if it's the usual thing isn't working, it's probably something else. The Noble Collective has this beautiful framework around losses and change that cause people to resist. And you can also find it on a variation on it on my LinkedIn profile. I wrote a thing about why leaders don't change their opinions. You can use that information to be like, they're afraid of a loss of identity. They're afraid of a loss of competence. And when you frame it that way, it's so much easier to unpack why they're fighting you.
Mm-hmm. One more build on that is it's so important to have the meeting before the meeting. So you've got a gut on something you think that is the right thing, the data says it. Enroll other people to gut check along the way. What do you think about this? I'm thinking about maybe going down this path. What would your advice be to me? What is your reaction to this? And have other people validate that before you end up at the stakeholder that ultimately can kill it or support it, because you're going to have those testimonials to help you along the way. So just as important when you've got multiple stakeholders that need to buy in, you got to be having those meetings before the meeting.
Yes, both of you offering excellent advice on that last question. I love it. I hate to say that we are out of time, but I want to thank you both, Dr. Ken Matos and Chloe McKenzie, for joining us today. No pressure, but there's a lot of people that said that this was by far the best webinar of the year so far. So hopefully you'll join us again. Thank you so much for that informative webinar. To those of you in attendance looking for that activity ID, it's 695-672, again, 695-672, and this has been approved for 1 business credit towards your recertification. Again, we thank our colleagues at HiBob for bringing us this great webinar today. Chloe, Dr. Matos, thank you so much again. We hope you have a wonderful week, and thanks for all of your excellent insight. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too.
Having us.